everyone, welcome back to my channel for a brand new mystery with Molly. If you are new around here, if you have never seen my face on your screen before, then hi, my name is Molly and I post true crime videos every single week. So if you think that that is something that you might want to stick around for, then please do subscribe and don't forget to switch on the little notification bell so that YouTube will let you know whenever I post a new video. This week I actually have a little bit of a different video for you. Today we're going to be talking about case updates. I did a video like this coming up to a year ago now where I went through any major developments in cases that I'd covered in the past, developments that had happened and come out since my videos on them. And I thought I would make another case updates video for you today because I have some pretty big updates to share with you. 5 separate cases that have had some recent developments, and a couple of these have even been solved now. When I covered them, they were unsolved and now they have been solved, which is amazing. Before we get into it, I do just want to mention that I will be giving a very brief summary of the cases before I get into the actual updates, just to kind of jog your memory. But I will not be going into major detail because obviously I did that in my original videos. So if you would like to watch the original videos, I will leave those linked down below. So the first update that I have to share with you is in regards to the case of Corrine Glackin. I covered Corrine's case, I think, in January of 2021. She was a 14-year-old girl who lived with her mother Margaret in Bonhill, which is a town located in Dunbartonshire in Scotland. On the evening of Saturday the 24th of August 1996, Corrine decided to go and hang out with a couple of her friends around some local shops in Bonhill. And then later that evening, Corrine was supposed to be going back to her house with one of her friends, Joanne. They were going to have a sleepover that night. However, it got to around midnight when Corrine decided that she didn't want to go home just yet. She decided that she was going to walk all the way to a village called Renton in Dunbartonshire because that was where her boyfriend lived, her 18-year-old boyfriend. She wanted to go and see him that night. She did ask her friend Joanne to walk to Renton with her, but Joanne didn't want to because it was already so late and of course it was dark outside, so she didn't really feel comfortable doing the walk. And so Corrine proceeded to just go on her own. To get there, she would have had to walk along a main road and then along an unlit towpath located alongside a river called the River Leven. So she started her journey, however she never made it to her destination, and just the next day 14-year-old Corrine Glackin was found murdered. Corrine's dead body was discovered by a member of the public, half submerged in the River Leven next to the towpath that she would have been walking along the night before. She had sustained very severe head injuries. She had suffered blunt force trauma to the head, and this, paired with drowning, was determined to have been her cause of death. The pathologist couldn't actually determine whether she was conscious or not when she was put in the water. She was still alive, but it's very possible that the head injuries that she sustained had knocked her out, so she was unconscious when she was put into the river. She was fully clothed when she was found, apart from her shoes were for some reason just placed on the embankment next to the river. There was no evidence to indicate that she had been sexually assaulted, and traces of blood were found at the scene. There was blood on the towpath, which indicated that that's where the attack started. She was attacked while she was walking along the towpath, and then her body was dumped in the river and she drowned. Now, after a murder investigation was set up, the police did receive a couple of tips and leads from members of the public. A couple of people came forward saying that they had seen Corrine that night walking on her own. She was seen by a taxi driver walking towards the River Leven, and he was actually one of the last people to see her alive. And he also described seeing a young man with, quote, sharp facial features standing about 30 yards behind Corrine. It was almost like he was watching her. Other people came forward saying that they remembered hearing a commotion, like an argument that night. They heard a woman's voice shouting something like, "I didn't do that," and "I didn't say that." So at the time it was theorized that this was Caroline possibly arguing with her killer or killers just before they killed her. Other witnesses said that they saw two men running not too far from the area where Caroline's body was later found. And again, it was theorized that these two men were her killers and they were possibly running away from the scene. A composite sketch of a man seen in a dark coloured hoodie that night by a few witnesses was created, and this composite sketch was released to the public. However, despite this, the police were unable to identify him, and Caroline's case quickly went cold. Around 2016-2017 time, her case was reopened, and detectives announced that forensic scientists were going to carefully examine several pieces of evidence that were collected and stored back in 1996 when Caroline was killed. They were going to carry out forensic tests on this evidence in an attempt to hopefully pick up traces of the killer's DNA. And the update in this case is that in November of 2021, so just 5 months ago now, and more than 25 years after the crime, it was announced that an arrest had been made. 3 arrests, actually. 3 people were arrested in connection with the death of Caroline Glackin. It was 2 men and a woman, 43-year-old Robert O'Brien and 42-year-old Andrew Kelly, and the woman's name is Donna Brand, and she is also 42. At the time of Caroline's death in 1996, Andrew Kelly and Donna Brand were around 16, 17 years old, and Robert O'Brien was 18, and it turns out that Robert O'Brien was actually Caroline's boyfriend, her 18-year-old boyfriend that she was going to visit that night in Renton. The two started dating a couple of months before Caroline's murder, and of course Caroline's mother Margaret did not approve of this relationship at all. Not just because of the age difference and the fact that Robert was literally an adult man and Caroline was still a child, she was just 14, but also Margaret did not approve because O'Brien was apparently into drugs. So Caroline and her mum would argue about her relationship with him quite a lot. She really did not want Caroline to be with Robert. She felt as though he was taking advantage of her. Now, when Caroline was found dead, her boyfriend Robert was one of the first people that the police looked into, but as I said in my original video, there was no solid evidence linking him to the crime at the time. His house was searched and nothing was found, and apparently he had an alibi for the time of the murder. However, like I said, he was arrested more than 25 years after the crime in November of 2021, so some new evidence must have been found that implicated him, but what this evidence is, I don't know. That information has not been released. Apparently people in the local community had suspected O'Brien for years. Many people believed that he was involved in what happened to Caroline, and it was just his luck that he was able to get away with it for so long. As for the other 2 people that were arrested, Donna Brand and Andrew Kelly, I'm not entirely sure what their connection to Caroline was. I know that on the night that Caroline was killed, when she went out with a couple of her friends, one of these friends was actually called Donna, although I don't know if it was the same Donna. I couldn't find any information online about that. But according to a Reddit post, she had also been a suspect in the eyes of the locals for years. Alongside Robert O'Brien, several members of the community in Dunbartonshire believed that she was involved in this case. But apparently the locals had never heard of Andrew Kelly prior to this, prior to his arrest. Again, I don't know what his connection to Caroline was, and I don't know what evidence the police had against him, against all 3 of them, that they didn't have before. But clearly it was enough to arrest them in November of 2021 and also charged them. All 3 of them were charged with the murder of Caroline Glackin. They appeared at the Dumbarton Sheriff Court following their arrest, and all 3 of them made no plea. They didn't plead guilty, nor did they plead not guilty. They just didn't enter a plea. They appeared in court again a week after this in early December of 2021, and again they made no plea, so they were taken into custody, which I believe is where they remain currently. currently. And I don't really have any further updates to give you on that right now. According to a few sources I read, no further court dates have been made just yet, but it is expected that the three of them will reappear in court in April, so next month, and that their trial will be held later on this year. So hopefully, after so many years, finally Caroline will get some justice for her murder, and her family will finally receive the closure that they've been waiting for so long now. I'm sure even more updates will come out about this case in the next few months or so, so I will of course keep you guys updated on that. Next up, I have a Jane Doe case update to share with you, the Arroyo Grande Jane Doe case, which has recently been solved, which makes me so incredibly happy. It actually makes me quite emotional whenever I hear that a new doe has been identified and given their name back, especially when it's a doe case that I have talked about on my channel before. So let me just give you a brief summary of the case. So on the evening of the 5th of October 1980, two brothers were driving along a dirt road near the Arroyo Grande Wash, which I believe was like a dry creek area. This was located just south of State Route 146 in the city of Henderson in Nevada in the US. Anyway, these two brothers were just driving along this road when they spotted the dead body of a young female lying face down on the ground. She was discovered naked and she had been murdered. She had been stabbed several times in her neck and back, and she was also severely beaten. She had been punched in the face repeatedly, I believe so hard that one of her teeth had been knocked out. And in addition to that, she had been hit in the back of the head with some kind of heavy blunt object, probably a hammer. Her body hadn't really begun the decomposition process when she was found, which indicated that she had died only hours before she was discovered, probably less than a day. And her body appeared as though it had been washed after her murder. Someone had washed her body, and actually a piece of yellow shower curtain was discovered near her body. At the time, the police believed that this woman or girl was aged somewhere between 14 to 20 years old, and despite the fact that she wasn't decomposed, they really struggled to identify her, to find out who she was and who killed her. So as part of their investigation, post-mortem photographs were actually released to the public, and a number of composite images and composite sketches have been created and released over the years. Her fingerprints were taken and submitted onto databases. Her dental details were compared to other women's dental records, and investigators were able to obtain a DNA profile, but no match was found. And so because they were unable to find out her name, she was dubbed the Arroyo Grande Jane Doe, and unfortunately her case went cold and remained unsolved for years and years. However, I am so pleased to tell you that in December of 2021, it was announced by the Henderson Police Department that after more than 4 decades, they'd finally discovered the identity of Jane Doe. So when all other efforts and lines of inquiry failed to lead detectives to her name, cold case investigators decided to go down the route of genetic genealogy. And they actually enlisted the help of genetic genealogist Barbara Ray Venter, who was heavily involved in identifying the Golden State Killer, Joseph DeAngelo, in 2018. So they got Barbara on board, and detectives were hopeful that by using genetic genealogy, they might be able to find potential relatives of Jane Doe. And eventually, this lengthy process led the police to a familial DNA link. They identified one of Doe's potential relatives that lived in California, who had previously done one of those home genetic testing kits. So they followed up on this line of inquiry, and following this, the police identified identified two possible sisters of Jane Doe. And when DNA samples were taken from both these women and the samples were sent off for forensic testing, it was found to also be a familial match to the DNA profile of the Arroyo Grande Jane Doe. And from there, they were able to positively identify Jane Doe as being a young girl named Tammy Corrine Terrell. She was just 17 years old at the time of her murder, and she had been identified through her sister's DNA. Tammy Corrine Terrell was born on the 4th of July 1963, and she was one of 4 siblings. She had 4 sisters in total. During her childhood, Tammy and her sisters actually lived in a foster home. However, at the time of her death in 1980, Tammy was living in a place called Assurance Home in Roswell, which is a city in New Mexico in the US. And Assurance Home, I think, was like a big group home for young people to live in, a safe place for teenagers to stay if they had nowhere else to go. The day that Tammy Terrell disappeared was the 28th of September 1980. That evening, she and another young girl, a friend of hers, who I believe also lived in the group home, they went to the Roswell State Fair at the New Mexico Fairgrounds. However, when one of the staff members from the group home later arrived at the fair to collect Tammy and her friends, they realized that Tammy was gone. She was no longer at the fair. She just completely vanished. Tammy was reported as missing to the local police at the time. However, one of Tammy's sisters, Carla, said that the police didn't really care, to be honest. They did not take Tammy's disappearance seriously at all, and they did very, very little to try and find her and find out what had happened to her. They basically said to her family that Tammy was probably just a runaway, and because she was 17, almost 18, they were not going to look for her, which is insane. But that did not stop her sisters from searching for Tammy. They looked for her everywhere over the years. Everywhere they went, they looked for her face, just hoping that one day they would find her. But of course, they never did. And it would be more than 40 years before they found out why. The last time Tammy was ever seen was around 10 p.m. on the 28th of September 1980, and she was actually in the company of a white man and a white woman, both of whom were adults. They were possibly a couple, and she was seen with them at a restaurant called Denny's in Roswell. And then following this, she just completely vanished, and this man and woman that she was seen with were never traced. They've never been identified. As we now know, about a week after this, Tammy was found dead. On the 5th of October 1980, she was discovered murdered along a dirt road in Henderson in Nevada, which is very, very far from Roswell in New Mexico, where she was last seen. It's more than 700 miles away. So how did she end up there? How did she end up dead in Nevada? And did that unidentified couple that she was last seen with have anything to do with her death? I read on a few sources that the police, for some unknown reason, believe that the man and woman Tammy was last seen with were headed to California. I don't know why they believe this, but they do. And one of the main theories surrounding Tammy's disappearance and murder that I came across is that she was possibly a victim of sex trafficking. Perhaps that unidentified couple were sex traffickers, and they picked Tammy up from the fair on the evening of September the 28th, and they tried to transport her somewhere, send her somewhere that she could be sexually exploited. But maybe Tammy knew what was going on. She knew what their intentions were, and so she tried to put up a fight and escape them, and that's when they killed her. But as I said, that is just a theory. We don't know exactly what happened and what led to Tammy's death and who even killed her. And because we don't know, this case is still an active homicide investigation. The police have said that identifying Tammy has meant that they are only halfway to solving this case. They are still trying to identify Tammy's murderer or murderers so that justice can finally be served. So if anyone watching this can provide any information about Tammy's case, provide the police with a name or a new lead or anything, I urge you to get in contact with authorities, and the contact details that you need will be linked down below in the description box. The next case I have to update you on is another Doe case, a John Doe case this time. This Doe was known as Septic Tank Sam for several years until recently, when finally the authorities were able to reunite him with his real name, his real identity. It was the 13th of April 1977 in central Alberta in Canada when a married couple named Charlie and Mavis Mucklow decided to kind of clear out their septic tank on the abandoned farmhouse which they owned, and this farm was located in an area called Lindbrook, which is just outside the town of Tofield in Alberta. They didn't live on this farm, they just owned the property and the land, and they were going through the farmhouse's septic tank because they wanted to see if they could find an old pump in there. However, when they opened the tank, they noticed that there was a grey sock and a shoe just floating in the water, and they quickly realised that this shoe was attached to a human leg. There were human remains in this septic tank. So Charlie and Mavis immediately contacted the police to report what they had found, and when the police arrived at the scene, they drained the septic tank, and during the process they discovered a dead body. The body they found was that of a male, although it did take the authorities a while to determine that the body was a man, because of the fact that, number one, the body was quite badly decomposed when it was found, and also because his genitals had been mutilated. A yellow bed sheet had been wrapped around the body and tied with rope, and when this victim was taken for an autopsy, it was established that they had suffered a very brutal end. This person had been tortured before their death. He had been tied up, beaten and burnt with cigarettes and also a blowtorch. As I said, he had also been sexually mutilated, and then his cause of death was 2 gunshot wounds. He had been shot once in the chest and once in the head, and then after this his body was thrown head first into the septic tank, and then his killer or killers actually poured quicklime over him. It's believed that they thought this would make his remains decompose quicker, although it turns out that it actually did the opposite. The quicklime meant that his body essentially dried out, allowing it to be preserved for longer. It was estimated that this victim had laid dead and undiscovered in the tank for somewhere between 4 months to a year, and after the remains were found, the police got to work on trying to find out this man's identity and trying to catch the person or the people that did this to him. But unfortunately, they really struggled with this. They sent off his dental records to hundreds of dentists hoping to find a match. Reconstruction images of Doe's face were created and released to the public. They even made a clay reconstruction of his face, hoping that someone would recognize him and come forward. But to no avail. They couldn't identify him, and so because they didn't know his name, this victim became known as Septic Tank Sam. Sam Doe remained unidentified for years and years and years, for more than 4 decades, until just last year, 2021, when the Canadian police announced to the media and the public that they had finally found out Septic Tank Sam's real name. In 2020, the Alberta RCMP Missing Person Unit joined forces with an organisation called Othram to try and finally get some answers regarding the case of Septic Tank Sam. By this point, they had exhausted all leads, and they wanted to see if new DNA technology could finally lead them to John Doe's identity. Othram is a private company from from Texas, whose aim is to solve murders and solve DOE cases using a technique called genetic genealogy. Now, when Othram became involved in this case, they were actually able to develop a complete DNA profile using an old degraded sample that was taken from John Doe's remains years and years earlier when his body was found. I think up until this point, investigators were only able to get a partial DNA profile from the sample, but Othram were able to develop it and build it up, and following this profile was entered onto several different genealogy sites in Canada and the US. They were desperately hoping that they might be able to link it to any potential relatives of John Doe, and it was a success. They were able to put together a family tree of possible relatives. These relatives were then contacted and their DNA samples were taken, including a sample from a woman named Joyce Sanderson. And when her DNA was compared against John Doe's DNA, it was found to be a familial match. It turns out that Septic Tank Sam was her brother, a man named Gordon Edwin Sanderson, or Gordy as he was often called by his friends and family. He was 26 years old, and at the time of his death he was living in Edmonton in Alberta, which is about a 15-minute drive away from Toefield where his body was found. So just for a bit of background information about Gordon, he was born on the 22nd of October 1950 in Manitoba in Canada, and I believe he was one of 3 siblings. He had his sister named Joyce and also a brother named Arthur, and Gordon was also a father. He actually had his own daughter. It's been reported that Gordon had a really difficult childhood. He was actually taken away from his family and put into foster care at just 9 years old, and this was due to the 60s scoop, which was a Canadian policy that allowed child welfare authorities to literally take Indigenous children from their families and their communities and place them in the care system, where they would then be adopted by white middle-class families. And as I said, this is what happened to Gordon. He was taken away from his family and put into care at 9 years old, and following this I believe he was moved around a lot. He never really had any stability in his life, and as a result of his troubled childhood he struggled massively with drug addiction in his adulthood, and according to sources he had a number of run-ins with the police. He had a bit of a criminal history, I think. Gordon went missing in the year 1977, so the same year that his body was found in the septic tank, and the last person in his family to ever speak to him was his older sister Joyce, when he told her that he was planning to go and visit their brother Arthur, who lived in the city of Calgary in Alberta. However, Gordon never showed up. He never visited his brother, and he was never heard from again, indicating that it was shortly after this when he was murdered. In the early 80s, Gordon was reported as missing by his sister Joyce, and from what I can gather, the reason it was a couple of years until he was reported as missing was because he just wasn't that close to his family. You know, they weren't the kind of family that kept in contact all that often, so when no one heard from Gordon for a few years, I don't think anyone realised that he was actually missing. But as I said, eventually Joyce did file a missing persons report. However, sources speculate that this report may not have been taken very seriously by the police at the time because of the fact that Gordon had previous run-ins with the police and he was a drug addict. So they perhaps didn't look into his case and investigate it as deeply as they should have. And no connection was made to Septic Tank Sam John Doe at the time. And for more than 4 decades, Gordon's family were completely clueless as to what happened to him all those years ago in 1977 when he disappeared. Until, of course, 2021, 44 years after he went missing, when the DNA match was made. Finally, Gordon's family had some answers. But of course, they still do not have full closure because police are still working on trying to identify the person or people who did this to Gordon, who tortured and Glachan murdered him in 1977. The main theory surrounding Gordon's murderers seems to be that they were associates of his, criminal associates. We know that he did have a criminal history, so it's been theorized that he was possibly involved in some kind of organized crime group alongside his killers. But also I think there is a strong possibility that Gordon's death may have been connected to his drug use. Perhaps he owed someone some money for drugs, and when he maybe refused to pay it or he couldn't pay it, he was killed. Whatever the situation, Gordon deserves justice for his awful murder, and his family deserve answers. So as I said, this case is still being actively investigated today. Of course, as this case is quite old now, more than 40 years old, there is a chance that the perpetrators may be dead, but equally there's a chance that they're still alive and can still face punishment and be put behind bars for what they did to Gordon. So if anyone watching this video has any information regarding Gordon Sanderson's death, the contact details you need to report what you know will be available in the description box of this video. Next up, I have an update for you in relation to the Dean Corll case, the case of the Houston mass murders. Dean Corll, who was dubbed the Candyman and the Pied Piper, was a serial killer responsible for the murders of several young boys. I covered this case in 2019, I think, so coming up to 3 years ago now, and it's one that I think back to often because I think it's one of the most horrific serial killer cases that I have ever researched. What this monster did to his victims, what he put them through, is just unimaginable. Dean Corll operated in Texas in both the cities of Houston and Pasadena, and his murders took place in the early 1970s. Corll would abduct young teenage boys and young men and lure them to his home, where he would torture them, sexually assault them, and then murder them before burying their bodies. The bodies were buried in a couple of different locations: High Island Beach in Texas, Lake San Rayburn, and also in a boat shed that Corll rented. However, Dean Corll did not actually act alone. He had two accomplices. He manipulated and enlisted the help of two young teenage boys. Their names were David Owen Brooks and Alma Wayne Henley. They assisted Corll in finding victims and luring them to his home, and Corll would pay them a fee for every boy that they brought to him. But Dean Corll's reign of terror would finally come to an end in August of 1973, when one of his accomplices, Alma Wayne Henley, who by this point was 17 years old, killed him. He shot 33-year-old Dean Corll with a pistol, saying that he had, quote, gone far enough. Henley fired the pistol at Dean Corll a number of times and he died, and he then contacted the Pasadena Police Department and confessed, and the horrifying truth about Dean Corll's murders came to light. In the aftermath of Dean Corll's death, his accomplices, Alma Wayne Henley and David Brooks, assisted the police in locating the bodies of the victims. In total, Dean Corll had around 29 known murder victims. This is the number of bodies / remains that were found in the 70s and were confirmed to have been connected to Dean Corll. Although one of these victims is actually unidentified, his body was found, but investigators haven't been able to find out his name. He's a John Doe. He became known as the swimsuit boy because he was wearing swimming trunks when his remains were found. But it's believed that Dean Corll had way more victims than the 29 that we know of, victims whose bodies were just never found and have never been found to this day. In fact, in August of just last year, August of 2021, a search and rescue organization in Texas called Texas EquuSearch revealed that they believe there could be as many as 20 additional victims of this serial killer. 20 young boys who are still just out there somewhere. Their remains are buried somewhere and have just remained undiscovered for more than 4 decades. And so in August of 2021, Texas EquuSearch announced that alongside Pasadena Police Department and other law enforcement agencies, they were going to start a new search for these potential additional victims. A man named Tim Miller, who works for Texas EquuSearch, has actually asked families in Texas who had a male relative go missing in the 1970s to come forward and get in contact with the search team, because there is every possibility that that male relative may have been connected to Dean Corll, especially if that relative was just a young teenage boy that disappeared in the 70s. There is every chance that he may have been abducted and murdered by Dean Corll. As part of their new search, the organisation is using ground penetrating techniques to search areas that haven't been searched before. And if you watched my last video, the case of Carrie and Joe Peck, you may remember me mentioning a piece of equipment called a ground penetrating radar. It was used in that case, in Carrie's case, and it's equipment that can basically capture images below the surface of the ground without actually having to dig the ground up. So that is what the search teams were going to be using in this case to search for more remains. From what I can gather, they are mainly searching areas in Pasadena. According to reports, one of the first places they searched was a backyard behind a house in Pasadena. And I believe the searches are still going on right now. They started back in late 2021, but the teams are still searching, although there is nothing to report just yet. No bodies have been found so far. But Tim Miller said, quote, "We're optimistic that if we get to the right place, I think we'll have the right equipment to possibly have success. We're not normally optimistic, but if we don't do anything, there's no chance. I think we've got the technology, I think we've got the knowledge, and I think certainly we've got the determination to hope we can find more." He also said, quote, "If we can find one of these boys, it will all be worth it." According to some sources, the organisation even reached out to one of Dean's accomplices, Alma Wayne Henley. They wrote to him in prison. Obviously, he and David Brooks were convicted for their parts in the murders years ago and sent to prison for life. Henley is still in prison to this day. He is currently 65 years old, whereas David Brooks died in May of 2020 from COVID, actually. He died whilst he was still behind bars. But anyway, as I was saying, the organisation reached out to Alma Wayne Henley. They sent him a letter asking if he would help them with their search for other missing boys. They wanted to know if he could remember any other places in Texas where Dean Corll buried victims. But I don't know whether or not he has agreed to help them. I did read on one recent article that he confirmed that there were more victims than the 29 that we know of, but I don't know if he is currently an active part in the search process. But that is the update that I have to share with you in this case. Not a huge update because, as I mentioned, so far they haven't found anything, but I do think that there is a strong possibility that if they keep looking, they will find more human remains. I guess it's just a waiting game now, so I will of course keep you guys updated on that. And the fifth and final case that I have to update you on is the case of Amanda Jones. Amanda Jones was a 26-year-old woman from Hillsborough, a city in Jefferson County in Missouri in the US. She was a single mother. She had a daughter who was just 4 years old. Her name was Hannah, and Amanda was no longer with Hannah's father. She was divorced from him, and she was actually 8.5 months pregnant at the time that this case took place in August of 2005. So she was due to give birth very, very soon, and she was pregnant with a baby boy who she planned on naming Hayden. Amanda was such an incredible mum. She was so loving and caring and kind, and she was so excited about having another baby. However, the father of this baby was the complete opposite. He did not share the same excitement. The father of Amanda's second baby was a man named Brian Westfall, and he met Amanda just the year before this in 2004 at a party, and they got along well and they began a relationship of some sort. I don't think they became like boyfriend and girlfriend. I think they had quite a casual relationship for a short while. They just slept together a few times. Even though Brian already had a partner, so he was cheating on her with Amanda. But anyway, this casual relationship led to Amanda becoming pregnant with Brian's child, and when he found out about this pregnancy, he was not happy. He did not want Amanda to have this baby. I imagine probably because he didn't want the woman that he was actually with at the time to find out that he had cheated, and so he asked Amanda to get an abortion. He said that he would pay for it, but Amanda said no. As I said, she wanted this baby. She was so looking forward to having a second child. On the afternoon of the 14th of August 2005, about a week before she was due to give birth, Amanda Jones went to meet the father of her baby, Brian Westfall, at the Hillsborough Civic Centre, which is where he worked as a volunteer. He helped with the groundskeeping there. They met to discuss the upcoming birth of their baby, and interestingly, Brian was the one who arranged this meeting, despite the fact that he had previously said that he didn't really want anything to do with Amanda or the baby. So this was all very sudden and a shock to Amanda that he wanted to meet up to discuss their child. And it turns out that after this meeting with Brian, Amanda Jones was never seen again. She just completely disappeared after she met with him, and she has never been found to this day. She's never been seen or heard from, and her body has never been found. So because he was the very last person to see her when Amanda was reported as missing, the police of course immediately became suspicious of Brian Westfall. He clearly did not want Amanda to have this baby, so it was theorized that he killed her that day before she could give birth, meaning that her unborn baby would have died too. Brian denied having any involvement in Amanda's disappearance. He said that after their meeting that day, she went back to her car in the Civic Centre parking lot, and the last time he saw her, she was alive. However, so many details surrounding Brian and his story do not add up in this case. His story about the last time he saw Amanda had a lot of inconsistencies and things that just don't make sense, which I'm not going to go through now because I went through all of that in my original video, but these inconsistencies just made him appear even more suspicious to the police and Amanda's friends and family. They were certain that he was responsible for Amanda's disappearance. Brian Westfall very quickly hired a lawyer when the police started looking into him, and since then he has not really been willing to cooperate with detectives in any way. He did apparently allow them to search particular areas of his property, but not all of his property, which I think could be very telling. But despite how strange and off his account was, the police were never able to charge him with anything in relation to this case. There's never been any solid, concrete evidence to prove that he was involved in Amanda's disappearance. But regardless, he has still remained pretty much the top suspect in the investigation ever since this case happened. Investigators have continued to look into him and search for evidence against him for years, and the update in this case is that just last year, 2021, the Jefferson County Sheriff's Department began working with the Missouri Attorney General's Cold Case Unit, and detectives were actually getting closer than ever to being able to press charges against Brian Westfall. I don't know if that means that new evidence has come to light, but yeah, they were getting really close to charging him for this. And in October of 2021, Amanda's family's attorney actually filed a wrongful death lawsuit against him. But before this lawsuit was even really able to move forward, Brian Westfall actually died. Just a couple of months ago, in early December of 2021, Brian Westfall collapsed in his home after suffering a stroke. He was taken to the hospital where he passed away a few days later. So after so many years, just as this case was kind of gaining momentum, just before legal action was going to be taken against Brian, he died. I've got a statement from Amanda Jones's family, a statement that they made following the news of his death, which I'm going to read for you now. They said, quote, "The sudden death of Brian Westfall has shocked all of us beyond belief. We as a family feel cheated that Brian has died before we could find our daughter Amanda and unborn grandson Hayden. This news follows our recent legal actions against Brian, and we feel that another opportunity to get a step closer in finding them has been lost." They also said, quote, "We send our sincere condolences to his parents for their loss. We know all too well the heartbreak and pain of losing a child. Fortunately, the Westfall family can lay their child to rest in a sacred place. We still have not had that opportunity. We will continue our search for Amanda and Hayden to bring them home so that we can have closure and peace, and we will not give up until we get answers." Amanda's family's attorney has said that the wrongful death lawsuit is still expected to continue, with some adjustments being made due to Brian Westfall's death. So I guess, again, it's just a waiting game. We'll just have to wait and see what happens with that. Despite Brian's death, this is still very much an active investigation. Detectives have said that they are going to keep looking into it and following up on different leads and lines of inquiry, and they are still going to keep looking for Amanda. And there is still a reward for information in this case. The FBI has offered a $20,000 reward for information leading to the whereabouts of Amanda Jones and her unborn baby. So if you have any information to pass on to investigators, the relevant contact details will be available in the description box. But that concludes this video. That is all of the case updates I have to share with you. Definitely let me know your thoughts on these cases in the comments. As always, I would love to hear what you guys think, and let me know if you like this kind of video, if you would like to see me do another one again in the future. I mean, there probably won't be another one again until about a year's time, depending on how many updates come out in the coming months. But do let me know if you enjoy this case updates video, and also let me know of any other cases that you would like to see me cover on this channel. You can let me know your case suggestions in the comments, or alternatively, I do have a case request form linked in the description box. But yeah, that is it for this video. Thank you guys so much for watching. Please do give the video a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you again next week for another mystery with Molly. Bye!